Assalamu alaikum and good morning. It's good to be here. Thank you to Patrick, to Neil, to Shalhoub Group, and to H Advisors. And congratulations on your arrival here in Dubai and in the Middle East. We wish you every success. And thank you for gathering us here at this wonderful venue, this unique building, this unique institution, which is a museum that, unlike all the others in the world, doesn't look back to the past, but looks forward to the future. And how apt that is for this conversation on energy and climate change and the UAE's hosting of COP28 later this year. So I'm going to make some general remarks to sort of set the scene. And I'm going to start at the sort of high level, global level when it comes to energy and climate change. And without getting too technical, it's a bit early in the morning maybe for that. And then drill down into our region, the energy sector, and what our own company has done. Not to boast, but just sort of as an example of what is possible. So the first thing I want to start with, which may seem uncontroversial, but I think it is important, is that energy is a good thing. And the reason I say that is because sometimes it can be taken for granted. And there are those in the climate movement that have almost come to refer to energy itself as a negative, or even capitalism as a negative, or development as a negative. And starting from the premise that somehow human impact at all is a negative on the planet, and that the planet would just be fine if there weren't any humans on it. The reality, of course, is that affordable and secure energy supplies is what has made humanity flourish over the last century in particular. This country, the UAE, would not be able to sustain 10 million people without it. We rely on air conditioning. Europe would certainly not be able to sustain its population of almost 500 million without heating. And life expectancy has more than doubled, and hundreds of millions of people in Asia, India, and China, and now Africa have come out of extreme poverty and into the middle class, thanks to, in large part, the availability of affordable and secure energy supplies. So I think that's an important starting point. I, for one, am a humanist. I believe in humanity. And if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which the UN set, the 17 challenges for humanity, if you are in a developed country, a rich country, one of the OECD, perhaps the only one that impacts you and your life is climate action. On the other, well, there is also income inequality, which is a factor in some countries, but largely the other ones you can take for granted. If, on the other hand, you are in the developing world, the other 7 billion, then all of them matter to you. Health, education, clean water, good governance, and energy access. We live in a world where today we still have 900 million people without any electricity at all. And unfortunately, that number has been going up again through the COVID pandemic. We also have 3 billion people without clean cooking solutions, still using wood and dung to cook. And aside from the terrible emissions from that is the human health aspect. The World Health Organization has reported that that's actually killed more people in the last 4 years than COVID. So that needs to be recognized when we talk about tackling the climate challenge. We've had the Industrial Revolution. Since then, global temperatures have risen by 1 degree. And there is now this global consensus on the need to transition to a lower carbon energy future that prevents further temperature increases. And it is actually the developing countries that are going to suffer the most, and that are suffering the most already. And we've seen recently, whether in Pakistan or in other countries, in fact, if you look at it objectively, if you're in Holland, for example, then rising sea levels are not a huge problem for you. A lot of your country is already below sea level. You have the GDP per capita and level of scientific development to sustain that. If you're in Bangladesh, on the other hand, it's a completely different challenge. So we talk about the energy trilemma, which is how to balance affordability, availability, and sustainability. And those can sometimes be trade-offs. But what we've unfortunately been failing on in the last few years is all three, in my view. There's been, in my view, a misguided approach that somehow starving the supply of energy, of investment, is going to achieve what we need. And what we've seen is the opposite. We've had energy crises, and the war in Ukraine certainly exacerbated those for Europe, but it actually started well before. 6 months earlier, there was price spikes, and some argue that the war was maybe a consequence of, rather than a cause of, the price spikes, although it made them higher. We've had energy shortages, and because of the energy price spikes, the developing world has been burning more coal, and so emissions have been going up. So we're actually failing on all three legs of the stool, if you like, of the energy trilemma. If we look at the uses and needs of energy, we still are going to need a lot of energy, but the developing world is going to account for almost all the emissions going forward, the rise in emissions. So how to transition the developing world is a critical part of the agenda. Europe's emissions have been falling for nearly 40 years now. And Europe is largely, well, it's an aging population and a post-industrial economy. It's Asia and Africa where this is going to be won or lost, and why this year's COP here in the UAE, I think, is going to be so critical in moving us forward. If we look at oil and gas, oil is still going to be needed, but it's going to be used differently. So passenger car demand is not a growth area for oil now. But you will still need it for things like trucking, shipping, air travel, until you can find cleaner solutions. And there are big investments in areas like hydrogen, including from here in the UAE. The fastest growing demand is actually for making things, petrochemicals. So much of what we have in this room, the screens behind me or smartphones, everything we've relied on COVID, from sanitizers, all the vaccines had glycol as a stabilizing agent, protective masks, so much of the world around us, even in the energy transition, from the solar panels to the wind turbines to the electric cars themselves, from their tires to their bodies, so much is actually petroleum product, and that can be underappreciated. And then gas is a critical transition fuel. By displacing coal in Europe and America, caused 100 times more fall in emissions than all the electric cars in the world over the last decade. And in our region, gas displacing liquid fuels, in our own production in the region as Crescent Petroleum, actually avoids more than 5 million tons of CO2 a year, which is actually more than all the Teslas in the planet. Again, the role of gas displacing liquid fuels or coal and enabling renewables, which is intermittent. Because renewables, solar and wind, still can't be stored for any meaningful amount of time in quantity. And so when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, you need something, whether that's gas or nuclear. There's no form of energy that's completely clean, but it's how having the right mix. And for that, I want to commend the UAE's energy strategy for 2050, which was about 40% renewables, 40% natural gas, and then nuclear and other forms of clean energy making up the mix. And few countries have actually had that forward thinking to set a strategy that far out as well as the commitment to net zero. Finally, I just want to talk about what we've done as a company, just as an example. So we started over 50 years ago, headquartered just north of here in Sharjah in the UAE, and we were mainly an oil producing, well, totally to start with, an oil producing company. We now are across the region in places like Iraq and Egypt, and we are now over 80% natural gas. And I mentioned the role that that gas plays in avoiding emissions by displacing liquid fuels. But in our own operations, we've brought down our emissions and flaring to nearly zero. That was a several-year program, as well as our sustainability reporting that's been going on for many years now. And then so our carbon intensity came down to below a third of the industry average, but then we offset the remainder with carbon credits that were UN certified, supporting renewable power, wind power in China and Mongolia, displacing coal for power, to achieve and declare net zero carbon neutrality across our operations in October of 2021. And we've maintained that. So the message is all forms of energy are going to be needed, and how we produce it must be cleaner, lower carbon intensity, and how we use it is also going to be the case. And the UAE has been a pioneer, whether it's in carbon capture or investors in hydrogen at scale, first blue hydrogen and then green hydrogen. Hopefully we can get into some of that on the panel. So I think it is the perfect place to be hosting the COP28 meeting, and it's a great opportunity for all of us as corporate citizens and individuals to engage in the conversation and advance the mission which matters so much for our planet. Thank you.